on the peculiarity of the English. I was recently asked by my friend Michael Wood, the historian and filmmaker, if I could tell him what had happened to the debate about the origins of English individualism and the peculiarity of the English. Well, I'm not in a position to say how far this has seeped through the consensus of British historians and into education and so on, and one would have to consult younger teachers about that. What I can talk about is my own thoughts since this book was published, which was 40 years ago or more. So obviously one's thoughts don't stop at a certain book. So in 1978, The Origins of English Individualism was published. It was based on various sources, including the detailed study of an English village, Earl's Colne in Essex, and it argued that the English since the 13th century had been peculiar, unusual, as compared to other peasant societies. Among other things, there was a highly developed sense of private property, individualized property from the 13th, 14th centuries onwards. There was high social mobility. There was a very developed capitalist labour market and goods market. And there was a mentality and morality of a capitalist and individualist society then. So that the main argument was with Marx and Weber and others who believed that there was a great watershed, great change, and the origins of our modern world began in the 16th, 17th century. I pushed this back to the 13th century. Needless to say, there was a great deal of hostile reaction to this, and half the reviewers said it was a great book and the other half said it was rubbish, and one even said if I was right, I was the Einstein of history, but of course it was all rubbish. Since then I've been thinking about this, and one thing I've thought about is the way in which I came to suddenly rethink all my ideas and come to these conclusions. There were several factors. One is that I'm not English. At least I'm about a quarter English, and the rest is Scots, Welsh, Dutch, and so on. But I don't really believe in genetic explanations, though I think my Scottish ancestry through my father and my mother had some effect on me. Secondly, I come from outside England, in the sense I was born in Assam in India. Many of my ancestors were abroad and away from England for most of their lives. So I came to look at England a little from the outside and had to learn its culture at school. And then, as an anthropologist, that's the main influence. I've looked at England in the context of many other civilizations and societies, and particularly my experience as working as an anthropologist in Nepal. And looking from there, then England became very peculiar. So when the book came out, it caused a great furore, and 10 years later in my book, The Culture of Capitalism, I tried to answer the critics of the book, and whether I was successful, I don't know, but that was the state of play. Since then, I've modified my thought in various ways. One is that it was pointed out at the time, I think by Richard Smith, the medievalist, that my book put too much emphasis on individualism, the molecular, single, billiard ball English. And there was the question of how all this was held together. And I realized, as I worked particularly on the work of Maitland and his ideas of association and of Tocqueville on associations in America, that what made this possible, the individualism, and balanced it, was a very strongly developed sense of associations, of groups, of clubs, of civil society, into which people as single individuals joined. And they joined freely, so it was a kind of contractual relationship. It wasn't birth-based. And so you got developed this amazing local government system in England, amazing development of clubs and associations, and this was even more marked in America, as Tocqueville pointed out. So that was one balancing idea that developed. A second concerned the origins and causes of this phenomenon. It was pointed out to me by my friend Ernest Gellner that while he accepted my argument, where had it all come from? And why was England different from other places in Europe? So I then addressed this through various attempts and ending up with the last chapter of my book, The Invention of the Modern World, called The English Path. And in that I explained that I was now in a position to push the argument further back, mainly thanks to Maitland, and to see that what I'd started with the 13th century, you could go back to the 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, 8th. In other words, I was talking about an Anglo-Saxon form of civilization that went back to the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons and then the Vikings, and that differentiated it, or at least that was the point of origin, as Tocqueville would have called it. So I sorted out the origins, and then the question of divergence, looking at that through the work of the French historian Marc Bloch and others, I could see, and the work of Guizot, the teacher of Tocqueville, I could see that up till about the 12th century, as Bloch says, most of Western Europe was very, very similar, not much difference really. The legal systems and the political systems were very similar over much of Europe, and particularly Northern Europe. And then from about the 13th or 14th century, you began to get a great divergence. Mainland continental Europe went towards a Roman law and Roman political systems. It developed an entrenched peasantry. The royal power grew. The tension between the different parts of the civilization, the church, the nobility, the peasants, the townsmen, that tension was minimized so that royal and ecclesiastical power grew. And so you got the growth of centralized, bureaucratic, Roman law civilizations across Europe. But in England, being an island, and that was the key, it didn't. It remained what it had been, though with modifications. So Maitland's great work on English law went up to 1307. English law was laid out by then, and it remained, and it was still current when Maitland was writing in the later 19th century. So England remained an island in law, social structure, and later in religion and morality. So that great divergence I thought I'd explained. Then there were two further developments. One was that I realized that what I was talking about was not just an English phenomenon, but my friend Jim Bennett coined the term the Anglosphere, which was covering all the countries which were deeply influenced by England, obviously firstly America and then the British Empire. And so what I'd discovered was a pattern of civilization which spread over whatever the British Empire ruled, to a certain extent in India, but particularly in the white parts of the British Empire. This peculiarity was now a world peculiarity across much of the world, and differentiated it from other great civilizations like Islam or China. So that was another kind of development. And I also learnt something that I began to work in Japan, and I was amazed that in social structure and politics and law and economy, Japan was very, very like England. One historian joked that it was just an island which had been towed off the south of England near the Isle of Wight and plonked off China. Well, that sort of captures it, because in many respects, Japan was like the English. Its kinship system is identical to the English. Its economy is very similar, and so on, right before it became industrialized and modern in the Meiji. So that was an exception. Its culture, of course, is entirely different, but its social institutions were very similar. So the Anglosphere, in some ways, half encompassed Japan as well. And that may be one of the reasons why Japan was way ahead of the rest of Asia in being a successful capitalist industrial nation in the later 19th century. So my studies of English individualism, and I've looked at other villages now and read much more widely and engaged with a number of political philosophers and so on, and none of that has shaken my faith in what I, by accident, stumbled over as a young man in my mid-30s. And it's just one of those accidents. Many people had stared at the same material and come to different conclusions, often finding anomalies and just putting them on one side. And so what it's done is to help me understand myself as, at least in education and where I live, an Englishman, and to understand the differences, because as a world anthropologist, I can now look back on my own civilization, see it as peculiar and unusual, as E.P. Thompson put it in an article, The Peculiarity of the English. We are peculiar. We have to avoid the danger of making us too peculiar. As a Frenchman put it, people who live in corners think of themselves as peculiar. So one shouldn't overdo it. But there is something strange. And of course what's important is that something strange, which began on this small island, has now shaped much of the modern world. The British Empire is gone, and soon the American Empire will have gone. But being there has shaped the law, the language, the political systems, the economic systems, the art systems, much of what we see spreading across the world and we call modernity or modern civilizations stemmed. It wasn't clever of the English to invent it. Most of what they got from abroad, came to England from France and elsewhere, and India, and then it was modified and put into a new pattern and then exported to shape our modern world. So I feel a little Englander, which I've been accused of, an islander, but I'm also a citizen of Nepal and China and Japan and the world, which is what all of us are now. And we need to understand our roots, not gloss them over, not live in a world of myths. And by freeing myself from the assumptions of the early development of sociology and Marx and Weber, I think I can now look at the documents and the buildings and the history of my country in a way which makes sense and is a unified picture, a pattern of cultures, as Ruth Benedict would call it. And the pattern of my culture is very peculiar and in many ways good and in many ways less good. Thank you.